Sects in the English Revolution of 1648. After the fall of Munster, a schism again appeared between the more peaceable and the more belligerent tendencies of the Anabaptist movement. In 1536, a synod took place in the vicinity of the town of Buchholz in Westphalia. Batenburg, a leader of the militant faction, supported the views of the Munster Anabaptists on armed struggle, on the approaching kingdom of God, and so on. The followers of Ubbo Philips took the opposite position. This latter group gained the upper hand, although its adherents did not condemn their opponents in principle, saying only that even if Batenburg was right, the time of the kingdom of the elect had not yet arrived, and that it was therefore not yet time to attempt to wrest power from the godless. This episode marks the beginning of decreased political involvement of Anabaptists on the continent. Its more extreme representatives, the Familists, emigrated, via Holland, to England. It is worth noting that some Englishmen had attended the Buchholz Synod. One of them, Henry by name, took an active part in organizing the synod and paid traveling expenses for the delegates. At the beginning of the 17th century, the Anabaptists who had migrated to England began to merge with the movement of the Lollards, which had existed there for a long time. The English Revolution of 1648 coincided with a flurry of activity by all these sects. The example of Munster and Johann Bokelson gripped the popular imagination once again. A book originating in Quaker circles stated the following, for example, quote, "No friend has reason to be ashamed of his Anabaptist origins. Even in Munster they rebelled merely against the cruelty of the German tyrants, who literally like devils oppressed the souls and the bodies of the common folk. They were defeated and therefore declared mutineers. Their uprising was violent because their oppressors were still more violent." End quote. Among the apologists for the Munster Rebellion was Lilburne, a highly popular leader of the radical wing in the Puritan army. See his pamphlet The Basic Laws of Liberty. In another pamphlet of the day, entitled Heresiography, the following Anabaptist doctrine is cited, quote, "A Christian may not with a safe conscience possess anything proper to himself, but whatsoever he hath he must make common." End quote. In the middle of the 17th century, the sect of Ranters appeared in England. Its doctrine is strikingly akin to that of the Brethren of the Free Spirit. The Ranters believed that all which exists was divine and that the division between good and evil was a man-made concept. In mystical terms this was perceived as an identity: the devil is God, hell is heaven, sin holiness, damnation salvation. This led to a denial of morals and to ostentatious amorality. Thus Clarkson says of the period when he was a ranter, quote, "The very motion of my heart was to all manner of theft, cheat, wrong or injury that privately could be acted, though in tongue I profess the contrary, not considering I break the law in all points, murder excepted, and the ground of this my judgment was, God made all things good, so nothing evil but as man judged it." End quote. In the social field, the Ranters rejected property and marriage. In the pamphlet The Ranter's Last Sermon, we find the teaching, quote, "that it was quite contrary to the end of creation to appropriate anything to any man or woman, but that there ought to be a community of all things. They say that for one man to be tied to one woman, or one woman to be tied to one man, is a fruit of the curse. But they say we are freed from the curse. Therefore it is our liberty to make use of whom we please." End quote. In his pamphlet A Wonder, Edward Hyde ascribes to the Ranters the following view, quote, "that all the women in the world are but one man's wife in unity, and all the men in the world are but one woman's husband in unity. So that one man may lie with all the women in the world in unity, and one woman may lie with all men in the world, for they are all her husband in unity." End quote. Ranters were accused of performing rituals which involved a parody of communion and indiscriminate sexual union, similar to the Barilato and the Paradise of the Brethren of the Free Spirit. An act of Parliament was directed against the Ranters. It condemned those who preached, quote, "that such men and women are most perfect or like to God or eternity, which do commit the greatest sins with least remorse or sense." End quote. In the 1650s, the majority of Ranters joined the Quakers, so that it became difficult to draw a distinct line between the two currents. Religious upheavals of the day were exacerbated by the indignation aroused by Cromwell's foreign policy, the conclusion of peace in the Netherlands, which frustrated the hope of spreading the reign of the saints throughout Europe. James Naylor, a Quaker preacher, acquired a considerable following even within Cromwell's retinue. It was rumored that he was a second Christ. People wrote to him, saying, "Henceforward your name is not James but Jesus." When a visit by him was announced in Bristol, such excitement was aroused that contemporaries considered it likely that Bristol would become a new Jerusalem, a second Munster. When Naylor rode into town on horseback, thousands followed him. But he was met by Cromwell's soldiers, seasoned by their service in the Civil War, and they dispersed the crowd, seized Naylor, and took him to jail. His case was debated in Parliament for several months. It seems to have had political implications. It is possible that an uprising of Anabaptists was feared. Naylor's execution seemed imminent, but there were disturbances and an outpouring of pleas for mercy. Cromwell spoke in favor of mitigating the sentence. Naylor was publicly flogged and branded. A crowd of adherents surrounded the scaffold, kissing his feet, hands, and hair. Interestingly, the name Ranters reappears 150 years later, in the 1820s, when the term was applied to a certain group of Methodists. From their midst came the first organizers of the English trade union movement, men who had acquired the skills of popular orators in the sect. The movement, whose members became known as diggers, had sharply defined socialist characteristics. Externally, it expressed itself, beginning in 1649, in the seizure of communal land by small groups of people for joint tillage. This attempt at organizing communes, however, was a mere gesture, which led to no practical consequences, and it was the diggers' literary activity that proved to have lasting significance. Gerard Winstanley was the most important figure among them. In several pamphlets he proclaimed his basic idea, the illegitimacy of private ownership of land. He reported that he had had a vision, quote, "a voice and a revelation," end quote, and was preaching what had been revealed to him, quote, "and so long as we or any other maintain this civil property, we consent still to hold the creation down under that bondage it groans under, and so we should hinder the work of restoration and sin against light that is given unto us, and so through the fear of the Resh, man, lose our peace. And that this civil property is the curse is manifest thus, those that buy and sell land, and are landlords, have got it either by oppression or murder or theft. And all landlords live in the breach of the 7th and 8th commandments, thou shalt not steal nor kill." End quote. Winstanley viewed trade and money in equally negative terms, quote, "for buying and selling is the great cheat that robs and steals the earth one from another. We hope," he says, "that people shall live freely in the enjoyment of the earth, without bringing the mark of the beast in their hands or in their promise. And that they shall buy wine and milk without money or without price, as Isaiah speaks." End quote. The socialist demands of Winstanley were confined to the denial of private property, trade, and money. He was explicitly opposed to more extreme views, quote, "likewise they report that we diggers hold women to be common, and live in that bestialness. For my part I declare against it. I own this to be a truth, that the earth ought to be a common treasury to all. But as for women, let every man have his own wife, and every woman her own husband. And I know none of the diggers that act in such an unrational excess of female community. If any should, I profess to have nothing to do with such people, but leave them to their own master, who will pay them with torment of mind and diseases in their bodies." End quote. Winstanley constantly declared himself an enemy of violence as well, persuading his readers that the diggers would seek their ends only by peaceable means. But the emotional thrust of his message sometimes carried him beyond the point, and he raised his voice against any kind of private property, quote, "the cursed thing, called private property, which is the cause of all wars, bloodshed, theft and enslaving wars, that hold the people under misery." 32, p. 108, he says to his opponents, "But now the time of deliverance is come, and thou proud Esau and stout-hearted covetousness, thou must come down and be Lord of the creation no longer. For now the King of righteousness is rising to rule in and over the earth. Therefore, if thou wilt find mercy, let Israel go free. Break in pieces quickly the bond of particular property." End quote. The Diggers comprise only a single group in a wider movement during the period of the English Revolution. Supporters of the general movement were called Levellers. One of them, the London merchant William Walwyn, asked that throughout the country there be no fences, nor hedges, nor moats. A contemporary pamphlet ascribes to Walwyn the following views. Quote, "It would never be well until all things were common." And it being replied, "Will that be ever?" Answered, "We must endeavor it." It being said, that this would destroy all government, answered, that then there would be no thieves, no covetous persons, no deceiving and abusing of one another, and so no need of government. End quote. The author informs us that Walwyn never disproved these assertions. A few diligent spirits may turn the world upside down if they observe the seasons and shall with life and courage engage accordingly. Walwyn proposes. The Moderate, a newspaper espousing the views of the Levellers, wrote on the occasion of the execution of certain robbers, quote, "Many an honest man tries to prove that it is only private property which governs the lives of people of such condition and forces them to violate the law in order to sustain life. Further, they explain with much conviction that property is the prime cause of all clashes between parties." End quote. A pamphlet of the day says, quote, "Let us establish in regard to those who are called Levellers the following: they wish that no one call anything whatsoever his own, and, in their words, the power of man over land is tyranny, and, in their opinion, private property is the work of the devil." End quote. Unlike Winstanley, who preached renunciation of violence, the extreme Leveller groups agitated for terror. One of their pamphlets is entitled "Removal is not Murder." Their effort to foment rebellion was, however, easily crushed by Cromwell's troops. In almost all Leveller groups, socialist aspirations were combined with some form of atheism. Even Winstanley, who referred to voices and revelation and was fond of quoting the prophets, wrote of Christianity, "This divine teaching that you call spiritual and celestial is in truth the thief who comes and plunders the vineyards of human peace. Those who preach this divine teaching are the murderers of many poor souls." Overton published a book entitled, "Man is Wholly Mortal," or a treatise wherein 'tis proved both theologically and philosophically that as whole man sinned, so whole man dies contrary to that common disinclination of soul and body. His followers formed the sect of the sleeping souls. They believed that the soul falls into the sleep of death along with the body. The period of the English Revolution represents the last great surge in the fortunes of the sectarian movement. In later years, the characteristic figure of the prophet-come apostle disappears from the historical scene. The sects themselves also vanish, after having so persistently preserved all their typical traits for more than 600 years. The socialist currents of this period reflect the characteristics of a time of transition. On the one hand, they retain clear traces of their sectarian origin. This is exemplified by Winstanley's references to visions, revelation and voices and his attempts to derive his views from the scriptures. Direct ties with the sectarian movement on the continent can also be demonstrated. Some of the routes by which Anabaptism came to England have been mentioned above. These direct contacts were maintained throughout the period preceding the Revolution. For example, it was at this time that a bishop of the Bohemian Brethren, Jan Komensky, Comenius, settled in England. He was expelled from England in 1642, but his influence lingered for a long time afterward. The works of Komensky were translated into English by the influential Leveller pamphleteer Samuel Hartlib. On the other hand, many works produced by the Levellers exhibit a purely rationalist spirit and show no trace of any religious consideration. Certain of these writings belong to the new literary genre of socialist utopias. Such was Hartlib's Kingdom of Macaria, which presents a picture of life wholly subordinated to the state. The most important of Winstanley's works, The Law of Freedom, is also written in this style. For this reason it will be more properly discussed in the next chapter. Footnote: the last representative of the prophet-cum-apostle type may be seen in Wilhelm Weitling, who had such a great influence on Marx. In Weitling's career we encounter the characteristically endless journeys all over Europe, and to America, to preach his doctrine, and the phenomenon of a Christian vocabulary employed to propound socialism and violence, including a project for arming 40,000 brigands.